Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. Night fell heavily over the plantation, thick with the scent of damp earth and crushed magnolia leaves. The cicadas screamed from the trees as if trying to drown out human suffering, and the moon hung low, pale and watchful like an unwilling witness. In a small wooden cabin far from the big house, a woman labored in silence. Her name was Ruth, though no one of importance ever bothered to say it aloud. To them, she was property, another line in a ledger, another body owned. But tonight, she was a mother fighting not to cry out. Sweat soaked her dress as she bit down on a strip of cloth to muffle her pain. Another woman, older and bent with years of forced labor, knelt beside her, whispering prayers that mixed fear with faith. This was not a birth meant to be seen. No bell would ring. No doctor would be summoned. The overseer could not know, the master must not hear. Silence was survival. When the child finally came, his first breath was swallowed by Ruth's trembling hands as she pressed him close to her chest. She rocked back and forth, whispering frantic words into his ear, begging him not to cry, begging God for mercy. The older woman leaned closer, peering into the baby's face, and then froze. Her eyes widened, not with joy but with dread. The child's skin was pale, not the warm brown of Ruth's own, not the deep tones of the other children born in the quarters. This skin was lighter, unmistakably so. Moonlight slipped through the cracks in the cabin wall and fell across the baby's face, revealing features that did not belong to the slave quarters. A straight nose, thin lips, a softness that mirrored a face seen often on the porch of the big house. Ruth saw it too. Her breath caught, and for a moment she forgot the pain, the blood, the world itself. The truth rose like bile in her throat, bitter and inescapable. She had known this would happen. From the moment her belly began to swell, she had prayed the child would take after her, prayed that God would hide the evidence of that night. God had not answered. The older woman crossed herself and whispered, "Lord, help us." Ruth pulled the child closer, shielding his face as if that could change what he was. Tears streamed down her cheeks, silent but unstoppable. She did not need to ask whose child this was. The answer had been written the moment she was summoned to the big house months before, when the master's wife was away visiting family, and the house felt too quiet, too empty. She remembered the knock on the cabin door late at night, remembered the overseer's voice telling her she was needed inside. She remembered the long walk up the hill, her bare feet cold against the dirt, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might give her away. She remembered standing in the master's study, the door closing behind her, the weight of his eyes on her body. There had been no violence loud enough to leave marks, no screams, no witnesses, just power, absolute and unquestioned. Consent had never entered the room. Now that power lay sleeping in her arms. The baby stirred, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around her own. Ruth looked down at him, really looked, and felt her chest tighten. Despite everything, despite fear clawing at her throat, love rushed in uninvited. He was hers, flesh of her flesh. She pressed her lips to his forehead and whispered his name, one she would never say where others could hear. Outside, the plantation slept. The big house stood tall and white against the darkness, its windows glowing faintly. Somewhere inside, the man who owned Ruth, who owned this child, slept peacefully in clean sheets, unaware or pretending to be unaware of what he had done, of what now existed because of him. In the slave quarters, news traveled quickly, even when no one spoke. By morning, eyes lingered too long on Ruth's cabin. Women exchanged looks heavy with understanding. Men looked away, knowing better than to ask questions. Everyone had seen this before, in one form or another. Light-skinned children were not rare, but each one carried danger. Ruth did not leave the cabin for days. She kept the child hidden, wrapped tight, his face turned inward whenever footsteps passed. Fear lived in her bones now, fear of the overseer, fear of the mistress, whose return would bring sharp eyes and sharper punishment, fear of whispers growing too loud. When she finally stepped outside, the sun revealed what the moon already had. Heads turned, conversations stopped. Someone sucked in a breath. Ruth kept her eyes down and walked carefully, her arms tense around the baby. She could feel the weight of every stare, each one a silent acknowledgement of the truth no one dared say. The child slept, unaware of the world he had been born into, unaware of how dangerous his existence was. Ruth watched his chest rise and fall and wondered what future could possibly await him. Slavery had rules, written and unwritten, and one of them was this. Children like him were reminders of sins white men refused to admit. In the days that followed, Ruth noticed changes. The overseer lingered near her cabin longer than necessary. The mistress, newly returned, studied the baby with an expression Ruth could not read. The master did not come near, but she felt his absence like a shadow, heavy and intentional. At night, Ruth lay awake listening to the sounds of the plantation, every creak and footstep making her heart race. She imagined knock after knock, imagined the child being taken, sold, erased. She imagined worse. She held him tighter, whispering promises she did not know how to keep. This birth had not been celebrated. It had been concealed. It had been feared. And yet, it existed, breathing proof of a truth buried beneath cotton fields and polite Southern manners, a truth written into a child's face. In 1850, silence was not peace. It was a warning. And from the moment Ruth's son was born, the plantation's silence had begun to crack. The child grew quietly, as though the plantation itself were watching him, measuring each inch he gained. Ruth named him Elijah in her heart, though she never spoke it above a whisper. To the plantation records, if he appeared at all, he was simply listed as boy. No surname, no lineage, no claim to anything beyond labor. From the beginning, he existed in a strange in-between space, neither fully accepted nor openly rejected, tolerated rather than embraced. As a toddler, Elijah stayed close to Ruth's skirts, his small hand always clutching fabric as if afraid she might disappear. The other children ran barefoot through the dust, laughing and shouting, but Elijah watched more than he played. Even then he sensed difference. He was lighter than the others, his curls looser, his eyes a grayish blue that reflected the sky instead of the earth. Children noticed what adults pretended not to see. "Why he looked like that?" one child whispered once, not cruelly, just curious. Ruth pulled Elijah closer and said nothing. Silence had become her second language. When Elijah was old enough to work, he was not sent to the fields. The overseer waved him away with a flick of his hand and told Ruth the boy would help near the house instead. This was unusual, and everyone knew it. Field work was punishment and profit, and most children began there early. Housework, though still slavery, carried a strange, fragile protection. Elijah swept floors, carried water, polished shoes that would never be his. He learned to move quietly, to keep his eyes lowered, to make himself small in rooms that were not meant for him. The mistress watched him carefully, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with something closer to discomfort. She never touched him, never spoke to him beyond sharp commands, but her gaze lingered longer than necessary. The master remained distant. He passed through rooms without looking down, as though Elijah were a piece of furniture, but servants noticed the way his steps slowed when the boy was nearby, how his jaw tightened, how his eyes flickered for just a moment before turning away. Elijah noticed too. He noticed that he ate scraps from the kitchen instead of cold rations outside. He noticed that no one struck him, even when he made mistakes that earned others bruises. He noticed the way the overseer barked orders at everyone else but spoke to him in clipped, careful tones. Protection, he would later learn, could feel very much like isolation. Among the slave children, Elijah stood apart. They did not hate him, but they did not fully trust him either. He was called houseboy, a title that carried both envy and resentment. When games turned rough, someone always reminded him that he was different, that he didn't belong to them any more than he belonged upstairs. At night, Ruth told him stories in whispers. Stories of rivers that ran north, of people who walked into the woods and never came back, of a God who saw everything, even the things people tried to hide. Elijah listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word, though he did not yet understand why his mother's voice trembled when she spoke. Sometimes, late at night, Elijah would ask about his father. Ruth always answered the same way. "He ain't here." It was true, in the smallest sense. It was also a lie built to keep them alive. As Elijah grew older, differences sharpened. His reflection in the wash basin startled him more each year. He looked less like Ruth, and more like someone else, someone he saw every day but was not allowed to name. He began to study faces, to compare lines and shapes, to wonder why certain similarities felt forbidden. Education came accidentally. One of the master's sons, bored and careless, left books scattered in a sitting room. Elijah, sent to clean, stared at the marks on the page as if they were secret codes. A kind servant, risking punishment, whispered letters to him when no one was watching. Slowly, quietly, Elijah learned to read, just enough to know what was being kept from him. Knowledge brought danger. It also brought questions. Why was he never whipped? Why did the mistress look at him with something like fear? Why did the master never meet his eyes? Elijah carried these questions like stones in his chest, heavy and unanswered. The plantation functioned on routine, but Elijah disrupted it simply by existing. Guests visited and frowned. Some whispered. One woman stared openly and then abruptly changed the subject. The resemblance could not be unseen, and though no one spoke it aloud, the truth moved through the air like smoke. Ruth felt the tension growing. She warned Elijah constantly. Don't look too long, don't ask questions, don't speak unless spoken to. Fear sharpened her words, but love drove them. She knew how fragile his position was, how quickly favor could turn into punishment. Elijah tried to obey, felt it as loneliness. He watched other boys grow into men, watched them learn their futures early and accept them because there was no alternative. His own future felt undefined, suspended, dangerous. He belonged everywhere and nowhere at once, and somewhere deep inside, a question began to form. A question he would one day speak aloud. A question that would tear through the silence the plantation depended on. But for now, Elijah remained what the system required him to be. Quiet, useful, and unseen. A child who didn't belong, growing up in the shadow of a truth everyone feared. Elijah had grown into a boy now, slender and quiet, moving through the big house with the careful steps of someone who understood the delicate boundaries imposed upon him. He polished the silver, carried water, swept floors, and watched the daily rituals of wealth and power as if trying to decipher a secret code. Every action, every glance, every gesture of the white people in the house was a lesson in the unspoken rules that governed their world. And yet, no matter how carefully he moved, one truth pressed against the edges of his mind, insistent and undeniable: he did not belong. It was late one afternoon near the end of summer that the realization struck him in a way he could no longer ignore. The sun streamed through the tall windows of the drawing room, falling in shafts of gold onto the polished wood floors. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, dancing in patterns only a child's mind could find mesmerizing. Elijah was polishing the silver set used only for visitors, the kind that gleamed too brightly to touch with unclean hands, when he caught a movement in the mirrored surface of a side cabinet. The reflection froze him in place. There was the master. His eyes, sharp and calculating, rested on the room with casual authority. But it was not his posture or expression that caught Elijah's attention. It was the shape of the face reflected alongside him, the shadow of similarity he could not unsee. The curve of the brow, the straightness of the nose, the line of the jaw, they were there, unmistakable, mirrored in the boy's own reflection, as he leaned too close to the silver tray. He blinked, and the image shifted, yet the feeling remained. It was as if the glass itself had whispered a truth he had been too young to recognize before. Elijah stepped back, startled, trying to deny the evidence of his own eyes. Perhaps he had imagined it. Perhaps it was the light playing tricks, the reflection stretching and bending, as it often did in the glass and polished surfaces of the house. But the image persisted in his mind, a stubborn presence that refused to be shaken. For the first time he felt a question form in his chest, heavy and urgent, pressing against the fragile cage of fear and obedience he had built over years. A question that could not be silenced by whispered prayers or careful avoidance. A question that demanded an answer. And like a seed in fertile soil, it began to grow, deep and insistent. Why does he look like me? He did not speak it aloud, not yet, not while the master was near. Instead, he went about his chores with more care than ever, polishing silver until his hands ached, sweeping floors until the dust settled into perfection. He carried water with steady arms and placed it carefully on tables, his gaze lowered, his mind racing with thoughts he could not yet express. He was learning the art of invisibility, but the reflection haunted him, unrelenting. That evening, after the sun had set and the last of the servants had retreated to the quarters, Elijah sat by the fire in the small cabin he shared with Ruth. The shadows of the flames flickered across the rough wooden walls, stretching and shrinking like silent specters. He held his knees close to his chest, his fingers tracing the lines in the dirt floor as if they held answers. "Mother," he said softly, his voice trembling despite himself. I saw him today." His eyes were wide and his throat tight. He swallowed hard. "I saw him in the glass, and he looks like me. His voice faltered, caught between fear and the urgent need to speak the truth. Ruth's heart stopped. She had known this moment would come, had dreaded it for months, perhaps even years. She wanted to soothe him, to tell him it was nothing, but the lie would be impossible to maintain now. She shook her head slightly, fear glinting in her eyes. "Elijah," she said gently, though her own voice wavered, "you must not speak of what you see. Never speak it aloud." "But Mother," Elijah pressed, the words tumbling out in a rush, "why does he look like me? His eyes, his face, it's the same. Why?" He looked at her with the honesty and trust only a child could afford, the unfiltered need for truth that terrified her. Ruth reached out and took his hands in hers, roughened by years of labor, holding them tightly as though her grip alone could shield him from the horrors she had known. "There are things, Elijah," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Things that people do that are meant to stay hidden. Some truths are dangerous to speak. Some truths must be carried in silence." Elijah did not understand fully. He only knew that something was wrong, something hidden in plain sight, something that could not be named. His mother's fear spoke louder than any explanation could, and yet even in that moment the seed of knowledge had taken root. He would remember this night forever, the night the reflection in the glass became more than a simple image, the night he glimpsed the shadow of a secret that would define his life. In the following weeks, Elijah became more careful, more deliberate in his movements. He watched the master from a distance, noting the way he held himself, the subtle gestures he made unconsciously, the tilt of his head when he considered a problem. Every detail mirrored his own behaviors, his own mannerisms, and each resemblance cut deeper eye. And to the boy's consciousness, he began to notice the way other slaves glanced at him, their expressions tightening, their whispers hushed when he approached. They knew, or they suspected, and he felt the weight of their unspoken acknowledgement pressing on him like chains. The master, for his part, seemed oblivious, or perhaps intentionally indifferent. He did not raise Elijah in favor, did not claim him as kin. Yet there were moments, brief and fleeting, when he lingered in the boy's presence longer than necessary, when his eyes seemed to search for something in Elijah's face, something he dared not name. Those moments passed quickly, masked by the routines of power and propriety. But Elijah sensed them, and each one confirmed the truth he feared and longed to understand. Ruth noticed the change in her son. The boy who had once been quiet and obedient now carried attention in his movements, a careful awareness that went beyond his years. She recognized the signs of a mind grappling with knowledge too dangerous to articulate. And every night she warned him again, "Do not speak, do not ask, keep your thoughts to yourself. It is not safe." Yet Elijah's mind was restless. Sleep came reluctantly, filled with dreams that blurred the line between reality and fear. In those dreams he stood before the master, their faces identical in the moonlight, and the house around them dissolved into shadows and whispers. Sometimes he saw himself in the fields, surrounded by other children, and the difference between him and them was a chasm he could not cross. He woke with a start, heart pounding, the early morning air cold against his skin, and he knew he could not remain silent forever. The household began to notice subtle changes as well. The house servants whispered about the boy, their voices cautious but tinged with curiosity. The mistress frowned more often, her steps echoing through the hallways with impatience. The overseer watched Elijah with a new intensity, as though waiting for a misstep that would confirm or deny suspicions he dared not voice. The tension in the big house grew, unspoken yet palpable, like the tightening of a rope around a throat. Elijah's education, such as it was, continued in secret. He read whenever he could, memorizing letters, words, and phrases that opened doors to understanding. The books, left carelessly in the study or carried in secret from the shelves, became mirrors as much as the cabinet glass had been. Each story of history, law, or philosophy gave him tools to question, to understand, to see patterns that others overlooked. And yet, each lesson reminded him of the dangerous difference he embodied. Knowledge, he realized, was a double-edged sword. It illuminated truth but also revealed the peril it carried. One afternoon, as he swept the study, Elijah paused to glance again at the mirror cabinet. The master entered the room silently, his presence filling the space. Elijah froze, hands gripping the broom. The mast. R stopped near the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the horizon. And in that stillness, Elijah felt a connection he could not name, a reflection beyond the physical, a recognition of shared humanity masked by power, privilege, and fear. For the first time, the boy understood fully what his mother had warned him about. This resemblance, this mirror of faces, was not merely a coincidence. It was evidence of a hidden truth, a secret that could destroy lives if exposed. And yet, the truth called to him, insistent and unyielding, demanding acknowledgement. That night, Elijah lay beside Ruth in the small cabin, staring at the rough ceiling boards as shadows shifted with the flicker of the hearth. His mind churned with questions, with images of the master's face, with the unspoken realities of blood and power. He had seen the mirror of himself in someone who ruled over him, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on his young shoulders. He turned to Ruth, his voice barely audible. "Mother, why does he look like me?" Ruth's eyes widened and she shook her head, pressing a hand to his chest as if to hold the question in place. "Elijah," she said softly, "some truths are too heavy for children. Some truths must wait." But the question had been asked, and once spoken, even in the safety of whispered darkness, it could not be unasked. The mirror had been seen, the reflection had been acknowledged. The boy who didn't belong had now glimpsed the first fragment of a story that would shape his life and the lives of those around him forever. Ruth's heart ached as she listened to Elijah's question echo in the quiet cabin. The boy's eyes, wide with innocent curiosity, reflected more than just recognition. They reflected the dangerous truth that had haunted her for years. She took a shaky breath, trying to summon the words, but there were none that could shield him from the world they lived in. Some truths, she knew, were heavier than the strongest arms, sharper than the sharpest blade, and this truth, this secret born of power, violence, and fear, was one she had carried silently alone, since that fateful night years ago. Ruth remembered the night with painful clarity, the memory etched into her mind as if carved into her very bones. It was months before Elijah's birth, and she had been summoned to the master's study, a room she had entered countless times to serve tea or sweep floors, but never in the manner that changed the course of her life. She had been summoned under the pretense of performing a task that required discretion, but the true purpose had been far more sinister, a private assertion of authority and desire that left her powerless to refuse. She remembered the cold of the hallway as she walked barefoot, the chill biting through her thin dress, the echo of her own heartbeat louder than the quiet murmur of the night. The door to the study had closed behind her, shutting out the world she knew, leaving only the master and the unspoken rules of his authority. She had felt a weight, a burden, that was not hers by right but imposed upon her, a power she could neither challenge nor escape. The memory twisted inside her chest, painful and inescapable. The child she carried now was proof of that night, a living, breathing testament to a sin that could not be named. She had prayed fervently during her pregnancy, begging God for protection, for mercy, for a chance that the child might take after her, might hide the evidence of what had been done. But no such mercy had come. The child's features, pale and unmistakable, were a mirror of the man who had caused his existence, and that reflection would not be denied. Ruth's fear was not only for herself but for Elijah. In 1850, the law and society offered no protection for children like him, children born of exploitation and secrecy. He was vulnerable, a target of jealousy, cruelty, and the strict hierarchies that governed the plantation. If anyone, overseer, mistress, or master, recognized the truth, the consequences could be catastrophic. A child could be sold, punished, or destroyed to protect appearances. And even among the enslaved, the knowledge of his origin could invite danger from those who sought favor with the master or feared association with scandal. Every day, Ruth navigated a world of careful deceptions. She smiled when the mistress scowled, nodded when the overseer barked orders, and shielded Elijah from prying eyes. She whispered instructions to him in the quiet hours: keep your head down, obey without question, and never draw attention. The lessons were simple but vital. Obedience was survival, silence was survival. But the weight of the secret carried so long in her own heart, pressed against her chest with unrelenting force. At night, when the household slept, Ruth would hold Elijah close, tracing the outline of his face with trembling fingers. She would whisper his name softly, letting it pass from her lips like a prayer, hoping the sound of her voice might offer some protection from the dangers lurking beyond the cabin walls. She longed to tell him the truth, to explain the circumstances of his birth, to give him the knowledge that might prepare him for the reality of the world he was entering. But she could not. The truth, she knew, would not save him. It could only destroy. And yet, she also knew that he would discover it on his own. Children were observant, more perceptive than adults often allowed. Elijah had already begun to notice the subtle differences, the glances that lingered, the whispers that stopped when he entered a room. He had seen himself reflected in the Master, had felt the strange pull of recognition that could not be denied. His question was inevitable. It was not a matter of if, but when. The challenge for Ruth was how to protect him once the question had been asked. Words could not shield him now. Knowledge had a way of breaking through even the most carefully constructed barriers. She would need to teach him restraint, to navigate the perilous social terrain without drawing attention, and to understand the consequences of truth in a world built on secrecy and control. It was a delicate balance, one that required vigilance, wisdom, and courage. Ruth also faced her own internal struggle. The secret she carried was not merely about survival, it was about identity, lineage, and the theft of autonomy. Her body had been violated, her life shaped by forces beyond her control, and now her child embodied that violation. She had to reconcile her love for Elijah with the anger, fear, and resentment that burned within her. Each glance at him reminded her of what had been taken, of the powerlessness she had endured, and of the society that sanctioned such abuse while pretending to uphold morality. The burden of this knowledge was isolating. Among the enslaved, she could not speak openly. Among the white household, she was powerless to challenge authority. Friends and confidants might offer sympathy, but they could not change the realities of the plantation, nor could they protect Elijah from the dangers inherent in his existence. She was alone in her knowledge, a solitary guardian of a truth that could not be revealed without catastrophic consequences. Ruth's fear extended beyond the immediate dangers. She understood that Elijah's appearance and the implications of his lineage could shape his future in profound ways. He might be subjected to favoritism or cruelty, both of which carried risks. He might be claimed, sold, or removed from her care. His identity could be used against him, leveraged as a tool of control or manipulation. Every action she took, every word she spoke, had to consider these possibilities. She was constantly calculating, constantly anticipating, constantly shielding him from forces he could not yet comprehend. Yet amidst the fear, there was also a fierce, unwavering love. Ruth's devotion to Elijah was absolute. She nurtured him, fed him, taught him the skills necessary to survive in the quarters and the big house alike. She instilled in him a sense of caution, a knowledge of human nature, and the ability to read intentions in subtle gestures. She encouraged curiosity within safe bounds and celebrated small victories in learning and growth. Her love was both protective and empowering, a shield against the harsh realities of the plantation. As Elijah grew, Ruth continued to navigate the dangerous balance between truth and secrecy. She guided him with care, allowing him to explore the world in small, controlled ways while teaching him the limits imposed by their society. She encouraged observation and reflection, helping him to understand the hierarchy of power without exposing him to unnecessary risk. Her wisdom, born of experience and necessity, became the foundation upon which Elijah would build his understanding of the world. The constant vigilance required of Ruth was exhausting. Every day was a careful negotiation, a tightrope walk between survival and revelation. She monitored conversations, observed behavior, and anticipated threats. She mitigated risk wherever possible, intervened quietly to prevent harm, and created safe spaces for Elijah to grow within the constraints imposed upon them. Her life became a testament to resilience, intelligence, and maternal devotion, shaped by the imperatives of secrecy and survival. Ruth also understood the psychological impact of the secret on Elijah. She recognized the tension, the curiosity, the growing awareness of difference. She knew that as he matured, questions would intensify, and the need for answers would become urgent. She prepared him for a world where his identity could be a source of both danger and power, teaching him discretion, empathy, and self-awareness. She instilled lessons in observation and restraint, shaping his understanding of social dynamics, human behavior, and the importance of strategic silence. The weight of Ruth's secret was compounded by the broader context of slavery in 1850. The social, legal, and economic structures of the South reinforced the dangers inherent in Elijah's existence. Laws were designed to control, exploit, and dehumanize enslaved people, and social norms reinforced rigid hierarchies and strict codes of conduct. The implications of Elijah's parentage were magnified within this context, making discretion and survival paramount. Ruth's awareness of these realities informed every decision she made, every precaution she took, and every lesson she imparted. Despite the fear and danger, Ruth also nurtured hope. She imagined a future in which Elijah could survive, perhaps even thrive, despite the oppressive structures surrounding them. She dreamed of opportunities for education, skill development, and self-determination, understanding that such possibilities were rare but not impossible. Her hope was cautious, tempered by realism, yet persistent, providing a counterbalance to the constant vigilance required by their circumstances. Ruth's guidance extended to moral and ethical instruction. She taught Elijah to navigate a world of injustice with integrity, compassion, and intelligence. She emphasized the importance of kindness, courage, and resilience, even when faced with adversity. Her lessons were both practical and philosophical, preparing him to engage with a society that would be unrelenting in its oppression but potentially navigable. With wisdom, strategy, and awareness, the mother's secret was not static, it evolved as Elijah grew. The initial shock of his resemblance to the master became intertwined with practical strategies for survival, emotional resilience, and moral understanding. Ruth's teachings adapted to his increasing awareness, his intellectual development, and his social interactions within the quarters and the household. The secret became a living entity, shaping daily life, guiding decisions, and influencing the trajectory of both their lives. Ruth's fear never abated completely. She knew that one misstep, one careless word, one moment of visibility could have catastrophic consequences. She remained vigilant, observant, and strategic, constantly assessing the environment and the people within it. Her secret was both burden and shield, shaping her identity as a mother, protector, and navigator of a perilous world. And yet, despite the fear, despite the constant danger, Ruth found strength in her love for Elijah. Her devotion was a source of resilience, a force that guided her through the challenges of slavery, secrecy, and social oppression. Her commitment to his survival, education, and moral development provided purpose and direction, reinforcing her ability to endure the weight of the secret she carried. In the quiet moments, when the cabin was still and the world seemed distant, Ruth allowed herself to reflect on the complexity of her life. She acknowledged the injustice, the fear, the powerlessness, and the love intertwined in every decision she made. She recognized the profound responsibility of her role, the necessity of discretion, and the courage required to navigate a society built on oppression and secrecy. And she understood, with a deep and abiding clarity, that her secret, dangerous, burdensome, and unspoken, was also an act of protection, a shield for the child whose resemblance to the master could destroy them both. Ruth's fear was a constant companion, but it was tempered by wisdom, love, and hope. She knew that the secret she carried could not remain hidden forever, that the day would come when Elijah would need to confront the truth of his existence. Until that day, she would continue to protect him, guide him, and prepare him for a world that would judge him by his appearance, his parentage, and the circumstances of his birth. Her secret was both a burden and a responsibility, shaping the lives of mother and child alike, and defining the delicate balance between survival, love, and truth in the perilous landscape of slavery. The question lingered in Elijah's mind like smoke in a closed room, persistent, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. Every movement, every glance, every conversation reinforced the unspoken awareness that his resemblance to the master was no coincidence. Yet the answer remained forbidden. Ruth had cautioned him over and over about the dangers of speaking aloud what he saw in the mirrored reflection, yet curiosity pressed against the constraints of obedience with an intensity he could no longer contain. It was not malice that drove him, nor rebellion. It was simply the innocent, burning need of a child to understand the world around him. It happened one afternoon, as Elijah worked in the kitchen carrying trays of food to the household staff. The air was heavy with heat and the smell of cooking fat, and the rhythmic clatter of utensils created a soundtrack to the quiet tension that always surrounded him. He was stacking plates when a fellow serve. Aunt, an older woman named Martha, leaned against the doorframe, her eyes soft but wary. She had noticed Elijah's hesitation, his careful observation, the way he studied the master and the household with a perceptiveness far beyond his years. "Elijah," she said softly, What's on your mind, child? You've been different lately." He froze, a plate slipping from his grasp before he caught it just in time. Heat rushed to his face. Martha's gaze was gentle, but it carried the weight of someone who had survived long years of slavery and seen too much to be easily fooled. Elijah wanted to speak, to ask the question that had consumed him for weeks, months even, but fear clamped down on his tongue. Ruth's voice echoed in his mind. "Do not speak. Keep your thoughts to yourself. It is not safe." Yet curiosity, once it had taken root, would not be silenced by fear alone. The truth pressed forward in him like a tide, insistent, unstoppable. "It's nothing," he muttered, forcing a smile he did not feel, and carried the plates forward, his hands trembling slightly. But Martha's knowing eyes followed him, and he could feel the quiet acknowledgement in her gaze. Others noticed too. The slaves of the household were perceptive, understanding far more than the masters imagined. Whispers began to ripple through the quarters, hushed conversations halting when he approached, sidelong glances exchanged over work or at mealtime. Elijah's question was no longer private. The community around him sensed the truth, or at least the possibility of it, and the tension grew. In the structured hierarchy of the plantation, a child who carried the likeness of the master was a dangerous anomaly, a reminder of forbidden acts, a living proof of transgression. Each observer understood, consciously or unconsciously, that his very existence threatened the fragile equilibrium maintained by secrecy and fear. At night, Elijah's dreams were filled with reflections, mirrors, and faces that seemed to multiply and merge into one another. He saw himself standing in the big house, face to face with the master, their features indistinguishable in the dim light of the study. He saw Ruth clutching him in the cabin, her eyes wide with fear and determination. He saw whispers moving through the quarters, carried like shadows on the wind. He woke in the darkness, heart pounding, breath shallow, the question burning in his mind: why does he look like me? Eventually, the question could not be contained within the confines of dreams and silent observation. One afternoon, while alone in the cabin with Ruth, Elijah found the courage to speak aloud. The words stumbled from his lips, hesitant, quivering, yet resolute. "Mother, why does the master look like me?" Ruth's hands froze mid-motion as she adjusted the blanket around him. Her breath caught, and for a moment, silence filled the room like a living thing. She looked into Elijah's eyes and saw the truth reflected there, the same reflection she had feared would ever appear. His gaze was steady, searching, innocent, yet imbued with a nascent understanding of the world's complexity. Ruth felt a surge of protective instinct, fear for the consequences of this question, and sorrow for the burden she knew he now carried. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice trembling, "some questions, some truths, are dangerous." She paused, gathering her thoughts, her hands gripping his arms to steady herself. "You must understand that what you ask, what you see, it is not safe to speak of it, not to anyone, not even in whispers." Her eyes flicked toward the door as if the walls themselves might carry the sound of their conversation. Some things are meant to be carried in silence. Elijah's brow furrowed in confusion. He could not fully comprehend why a question so simple and natural to him could be dangerous. To him, it was a matter of recognition, of understanding, of knowing his own place in the world. Yet Ruth's fear was palpable, contagious, and it impressed upon him the gravity of what he had asked. He nodded slowly, though the tension in his chest did not ease. The question remained, like a spark that had ignited in dry grass, small, yet capable of consuming everything in its path. Word of the question spread quietly, in whispers and glances, throughout the quarters. The other slaves noticed the change in Elijah, the way he carried himself, the intensity in his eyes. They did not speak openly, but their awareness created a subtle tension. Some offered sympathy, others caution, and a few viewed him with envy or fear. The question, though unspoken to the wider household, became a shared secret, one that underscored the fragile balance between knowledge and survival in their lives. The master, unaware or pretending to be unaware, continued his routines, yet subtle shifts began to occur. Guests of the house remarked on the boy's presence, the way he moved with precision and quiet confidence, and the resemblance could not be ignored. The mistress, perceptive and wary, observed him more closely, noting every expression, every gesture, every nuance. The overseer grew more vigilant, monitoring the household and the slaves with a keener eye. Sensing the potential disruption that Elijah's awareness could bring, Elijah, for his part, navigated this precarious reality with growing awareness and skill. He learned to observe without drawing attention, to question without speaking aloud, to understand the subtle hierarchies and social cues that governed the household. Each day was a lesson in discretion, patience, and survival. Each glance in a mirror, each reflection in polished surfaces, reinforced the presence of a truth that was dangerous precisely because it was visible, undeniable, and unspoken. The tension reached a critical point one afternoon when the master's wife, returning unexpectedly from a visit, entered the household with her usual air of authority. Elijah had been polishing silver in the dining row. His hands steady but his heart racing. The mistress's eyes fell upon him, narrowing as she took in his features, his posture, the subtle resemblance that others had long tried to ignore. She paused, her expression unreadable, and for a moment the room seemed suspended in time. Elijah felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force pressing down on him, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous question he carried. Ruth's warnings echoed in his mind. Do not speak, do not draw attention, keep your thoughts to yourself. Yet the awareness of the resemblance of the secret embedded in his existence could not be erased. It was a part of him, as much a part of his being as his heartbeat or breath. And with awareness came responsibility. The delicate, painful responsibility of navigating a world in which knowledge could be as perilous as ignorance. The dangerous question also revealed the fragility of the social structures around them. Slavery depended on obedience, hierarchy, and the maintenance of appearances. Elijah's existence challenged those structures, threatening to expose truths that the household had long sought to conceal. The resemblance between master and child, once observed, could not be unseen. The potential for scandal, retribution, or disruption loomed like a shadow over every interaction, every glance, every whispered conversation. Ruth, acutely aware of the stakes, redoubled her efforts to protect her son. She taught him strategies for concealment, the art of deflection, and the importance of reading the room, of understanding intentions, and of gauging risk. Her lessons were born not of fear alone, but of love, determination, and the desperate desire to preserve life in a world designed to strip it away. She instilled in Elijah an awareness of power, a sense of self-preservation, and an understanding of the unspoken rules that governed the lives of the enslaved and the enslavers alike. Despite the danger, Elijah could not abandon the question. It lingered, a persistent, unrelenting presence that shaped his consciousness, his behavior, and his interactions. The dangerous question became a compass, guiding him through the complexities of the household, the quarters, and the wider plantation. It informed his understanding of human behavior, hierarchy, and the consequences of visibility. It sharpened his awareness, honed his instincts, and shaped the trajectory of his life in profound and lasting ways. The dangerous question also had a social dimension. Among the enslaved, awareness of the resemblance created subtle shifts in dynamics, alliances, and perceptions. Some treated Elijah with caution, others with envy, and a few with protective concern. The shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the resemblance underscored the delicate balance of survival within the quarters, highlighting the interplay of knowledge, secrecy, and social negotiation. Elijah became a living symbol of hidden truths, a presence that reminded everyone of the stakes involved in maintaining silence and obedience. And so, Elijah carried the question forward, a seed planted in his mind, growing with each passing day, shaping his understanding of the world, and defining the contours of his existence. It was a question that could not be ignored, a truth that could not be denied, and a reality that demanded both courage and discretion. The dangerous question had been asked, and its consequences would ripple outward, touching every life it encountered, shaping the destiny of both Elijah and those around him in ways that could not yet be fully imagined. The master, Jonathan Whitmore as the plantation records named him, was a man of careful habits and rigid expectations. To outsiders, he was the embodiment of Southern authority, tall, well-groomed, unyielding in demeanor, and commanding in presence. His reputation stretched across the county, whispered in both admiration and fear. But within the walls of the Whitmore estate, he harbored a secret that gnawed at him relentlessly, a truth that could unravel not only his authority but his very life. He had not anticipated that the child, born in the quiet cabin on the edge of the quarters, would grow into a boy whose presence could no longer be denied. When he first observed Elijah in the household, a small boy moving with a strange grace and care that set him apart from the others, a flicker of recognition stirred. At first he dismissed it, rationalized it as imagination, coincidence, or a trick of the mind. But as days turned into weeks, that flicker grew into a persistent, haunting awareness. Jonathan's reflection in polished furniture, in mirrors, in the glinting surfaces of silver, confronted him daily. Elijah's features, the grayish-blue eyes, the straight nose, the line of the jaw, were a mirror of his own. He saw himself in the boy in ways he could not ignore, and each glance reinforced the knowledge that his secret, the act committed months before, the violation masked by wealth and power, was now embodied in a living, breathing reminder. He did not speak of it. He could not. To acknowledge Elijah publicly would be to admit an act that society considered unforgivable. To punish the boy openly could be perceived as cruelty or suspicion, drawing attention to what he most wanted to hide. Jonathan lived in a constant state of silent calculation, weighing the risks of every word, every glance, every interaction with Elijah. The boy's presence threatened the delicate facade he had constructed, a facade built on appearances, propriety, and social hierarchy. Every day Jonathan faced Elijah, yet refrained from claiming him, acknowledging him, or even confronting the resemblance directly. It was a torment of quiet guilt and calculated avoidance. He watched the boy work, observed the careful precision of his movements, the intelligence reflected in his eyes, the subtle grace that mirrored his own habits. Each observation deepened the awareness that this child was connected to him in ways he had never intended to confront publicly. Guilt and fear intertwined, creating a complex web of emotions that Jonathan could not disentangle. Guilt for what he had done, for the violation of Ruth's body and autonomy, fear for the potential exposure, for the consequences that could ripple through his household, his social standing, and the law. He recognized that the child was a living accusation, a reminder of his moral failure and the societal hypocrisy that allowed such acts to remain hidden, yet morally condemnable if discovered. Jonathan began to notice small changes within himself. His voice became sharper when addressing the household staff, his expressions more guarded when in the presence of guests, and his movements deliberate to avoid revealing any connection to Elijah. He monitored interactions between the boy and other servants, his jealousy and anxiety manifesting in subtle ways that even the most perceptive observers could not fully interpret. His authority, long assumed to be unshakable, now felt brittle, vulnerable to exposure from the smallest misstep. The master's guilt was not a passive emotion, it actively shaped his behavior. He made choices aimed at maintaining distance from Elijah, yet paradoxically ensured that the boy remained within the household's inner sphere, protected from field labor and other potential dangers. This contradictory behavior, born of a mixture of shame, fear, and unspoken attachment, created tension among the household staff, who observed the unusual treatment without fully understanding its cause. Rumors, careful and hushed, began to circulate, though no one dared speak openly of the boy's origins. At night, Jonathan lay awake in his bedchamber, staring at the polished wood of the floorboards, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that seemed to echo his inner turmoil. He contemplated the possibility of selling the boy, removing him from the estate to erase the evidence of his transgression, but the thought was unbearable. To do so would be an act of cruelty that could not be justified even in the rigid moral framework of the time. And yet, to claim him would be to invite scandal, social ruin, and legal peril. The silence of guilt became a constant companion. Jonathan's thoughts revolved around strategies to maintain secrecy, to manage appearances, and to control the growing awareness surrounding Elijah. He observed interactions carefully, instructed the overseer on duties with extra caution, and monitored the mistress's attention toward the boy. Every gesture, every word, was calculated to maintain a delicate equilibrium between concealment and exposure. He also recognized the intelligence and perceptiveness of Elijah. The boy's awareness was subtle but undeniable, and Jonathan understood that a single misstep could unravel the careful balance of secrecy he had constructed. The child's understanding of his own resemblance introduced a variable into the household. LD dynamic that Jonathan could neither control fully nor ignore. Each glance, each expression, each question left unasked, contributed to a growing tension that permeated the estate. Jonathan's guilt extended beyond practical concerns. He felt a profound moral awareness, a recognition of the wrong he had committed and the human cost of his actions. Ruth's labor, her suffering, and her fear were constant reminders of the act's impact, and the boy's very existence served as an ongoing testament to the consequences of unchecked power. The realization that he had created a life intertwined with transgression weighed heavily, shaping his thoughts, interactions, and self-perception. In the presence of other men, neighbors, relatives, business associates, Jonathan maintained his composure, presenting the facade of authority, confidence, and propriety. Yet internally he was constantly calculating, monitoring the potential for exposure, and managing the implications of Elijah's resemblance. The silent guilt he carried was both a burden and a guide, influencing every decision with a blend of fear, shame, and instinctive protection. Jonathan also recognized the emotional complexity of his attachment to the boy. Despite the circumstances of Elijah's conception, the child was undeniably his own, a reflection of both his body and, in subtle ways, his mannerisms and intelligence. This awareness created a paradoxical mixture of affection, responsibility, and fear. He could not express the attachment publicly, yet it influenced his actions daily, shaping the way he allowed Elijah to move within the household, the tasks assigned, and the protection afforded. The mistress of the house, perceptive and socially aware, began to notice Jonathan's subtle preoccupations. She observed the way he lingered in rooms longer than necessary, the calculated manner in which he assessed interactions, and the occasional tension in his expression when Elijah was present. While she did not speak openly, her awareness added another layer of pressure, a silent reminder of the social dynamics Jonathan had to navigate carefully to avoid suspicion. The overseer, too, began to detect the unusual circumstances surrounding Elijah. He noted the boy's proximity to the house, the peculiar assignments, and the subtle difference in treatment compared to other children of similar age. Though he could not fully understand the origins of the situation, he became more vigilant, anticipating potential disruptions or questions that could expose hidden truths. Jonathan, aware of the overseer's attentiveness, adjusted his behavior accordingly. Reinforcing the intricate balance of concealment and control, Jonathan's silent guilt also manifested in moments of private reflection. He considered alternative courses of action, weighing the potential consequences of claiming the boy, selling him, or maintaining the status quo. Each option carried significant risk, moral and practical, and none offered a simple resolution. The act that had initially seemed confined to a single night now reverberated through every aspect of his life, shaping the dynamics of the household, his relationships, and his self-perception. Despite the oppressive weight of guilt, Jonathan's instincts for self-preservation and social propriety remained sharp. He navigated the household with calculated precision, balancing his awareness of Elijah's resemblance with the need to maintain authority and avoid scandal. Each interaction, from brief conversations to observations of the boy's tasks, required careful consideration, subtle manipulation, and strategic restraint. The master's life became a continuous exercise in vigilance, shaped by the presence of a living reminder of his transgression. Guilt also introduced an element of fear into Jonathan's psyche. He understood that discovery of the boy's origins could lead to public disgrace, legal consequences, and the potential loss of property or social standing. The moral and social implications were intertwined, creating a complex web of anxiety that influenced his decision-making and interactions with the household staff. Every glance, gesture, and word had to be calculated to minimize risk while maintaining the delicate equilibrium necessary to preserve both the secret and his authority. Yet the master's silent guilt was not solely about self-preservation. It encompassed a profound awareness of the human cost of his actions. Ruth's suffering, the boy's existence, and the moral implications of the act weighed heavily on him, shaping his perception of power, responsibility, and justice. The recognition that his decisions had created vulnerability, fear, and tension within the household added depth to his guilt, transforming it from a simple sense of shame into a complex, pervasive awareness that influenced every aspect of daily life. Jonathan's silent guilt was also a teacher. It sharpened his perception, refined his ability to anticipate risk, and honed his understanding of human behavior. He observed the smallest gestures, listened to hushed whispers, and interpreted glances with heightened sensitivity. The presence of Elijah and the unspoken acknowledgement of resemblance required vigilance and awareness that would have been unnecessary in a household without such a delicate, volatile secret. In conclusion, Jonathan Whitmore's experience illustrates the pervasive, inescapable power of guilt, especially when intertwined with secrecy, morality, and social structure. The master's silent struggle, balancing fear, responsibility, and unspoken attachment, demonstrates the profound impact of personal transgressions on both the perpetrator and the environment surrounding them. Each day was a careful negotiation between revelation and concealment, authority and vulnerability, love and fear. Elijah, the living embodiment of hidden truths, became both a mirror and a measure of the master's conscience, forcing Jonathan to confront the consequences of his actions in ways that could not be ignored, mitigated, or escaped. The quarters were alive with whispers long before Elijah realized the true weight of his presence. The enslaved men and women, seasoned in the art of observation and the preservation of secrets, had always known more than they let on. Life under the plantation's rigid hierarchy required subtlety, nuance, and an understanding that knowledge, when spoken carelessly, could be fatal. Secrets were currency. Survival depended upon silence, and every glance or gesture carried meaning. Elijah had long sensed the shifting glances, the hushed conversations abruptly halted when he neared, the subtle exchanges of understanding in the eyes of those older and wiser. But as he grew older, those whispers began to take shape in ways he could perceive, though never fully understand. He noticed Martha and other women in the cabin pausing mid-task, their eyes softening or narrowing when his presence lingered. Men would stand a little straighter, nod quietly, or whisper warnings when a certain overseer approached. The entire quarter seemed to hum with invisible knowledge, an awareness that the boy, whose resemblance to the master was undeniable, carried a truth too dangerous to name. Ruth, ever watchful, had long instructed Elijah on the nature of this hidden knowledge. "Keep your ears open, but your lips shut," she would whisper during the quiet moments of the night. "Listen to the rhythms of life here, learn what is said, and more importantly what is not. Understand that knowledge can protect, but speaking it can destroy." She had lived this lesson, carrying the secret of Elijah's birth with careful vigilance for years, and she knew that the community around them had already noted differences. Each whisper in the quarters was part of a larger tapestry, an invisible network that both shielded and warned. Elijah began to observe patterns. Conversations would pause when he approached, only to resume with subtle shifts in tone. Warnings came in indirect forms. "Watch the steps you take," one elder would murmur as he passed. Or, "Be careful who you meet in the fields today," another would caution. They did not explain, they could not. The truth was far too dangerous, and yet the very caution signaled to Elijah that he was under silent scrutiny. A boy whose appearance had already stirred recognition among those attuned to human patterns and the undercurrents of power. The whispered truths of the quarters were not merely about caution, they were about survival strategy. The enslaved had long learned to navigate the delicate balance between obedience, visibility, and personal safety. Elijah's existence altered that balance. He was a living symbol of a transgression no one dared name, a reflection of the master's actions that could ripple outward with unforeseen consequences. The recognition of this fact, though never stated directly, informed every interaction he had with the commune. It required him to adapt, to read subtleties, and to understand the language of silence that had protected generations before him. Even children in the quarters were aware, though in nascent and incomplete ways, of Elijah's uniqueness. They played nearby but kept him at a subtle distance, sensing, perhaps instinctively, that he was different, not merely because of tasks assigned or privileges given, but because of the weight of unseen truths he carried. Some envied him, others feared him, and a few were curious, drawn to the aura of difference that seemed to orbit him without explanation. Elijah, sensitive to these dynamics, learned quickly how to navigate relationships without provoking suspicion or resentment. He became adept at reading body language, interpreting tone, and adjusting his own behavior to fit the expectations and unspoken rules of the quarters. Ruth watched him carefully, guiding his observations and interactions. "Remember, Elijah," she would say, "people know more than they show. Every glance, every pause, every hesitation is a story in itself. You must learn the stories if you are to survive." Her instruction was both practical and philosophical, teaching him to discern the invisible threads that connected actions to consequences. In this way, Elijah's education extended beyond the confines of literacy and skill work. It encompassed social intelligence, emotional awareness, and the subtle art of negotiation under conditions of extreme vulnerability. The quarters themselves were repositories of wisdom, shaped by generations of enslaved people who had developed intricate systems of communication and understanding. Knowledge was layered, coded, and often transmitted through oral tradition, gestures, and symbols. Elijah, through careful observation and the guidance of Ruth and the elders, began to decode these layers, understanding that survival depended on interpreting both what was spoken and what was left unsaid. The whispers carried warnings, encouragements, and lessons about the structure of the plantation, the nature of the household, and the subtleties of human behavior. One evening, as Elijah helped prepare supper, he overheard a conversation between two older women, voices low and tense. "The boy, he carries the master's face," one whispered. "Keep him close, but keep him careful. Too much attention and he's lost." Elijah froze, the weight of their words pressing on him. This was the first time he had heard the truth acknowledged so openly, even in coded language. The fear and caution in their voices mirrored Ruth's teachings, confirming that the quarters were acutely aware of the dangerous implications of his existence. Despite this awareness, the enslaved community also demonstrated remarkable resilience and resourcefulness in protecting themselves and those like Elijah. His safety was woven into a network of vigilance, subtle intervention, and unspoken alliances. He was guided away from potential dangers, warned of social pitfalls, and shielded from exposure in ways that maintained the illusion of compliance, while preserving a fragile sense of security. The whispered truths were a form of protection, a collective intelligence that ensured survival without overt confrontation. Elijah began to internalize these lessons, recognizing the delicate interplay between visibility and concealment. He understood that his resemblance to the master could be both a source of protection and vulnerability. Favor in the household could shield him from physical labor or punishment, yet the same favor could arouse suspicion, jealousy, and scrutiny. Every action required careful calibration, balancing obedience with awareness, compliance with subtle assertion, and discretion with the occasional assertion of agency. The whispered truths provided a framework for navigating these complexities, a guide for survival in a world fraught with peril. The psychological impact of the whispers was profound. Elijah developed a heightened sense of observation, learning to anticipate reactions, interpret subtle cues, and adjust his behavior accordingly. He became attuned to the smallest shifts in expression, tone, and gesture, understanding that each carried meaning beyond the literal. This awareness sharpened his intellect, honed his instincts, and cultivated a form of strategic thinking that would serve him in navigating not only the immediate dangers of the household, but also the broader social and moral complexities of life under slavery. Ruth continued to reinforce these lessons with patience and care. She instructed Elijah on the moral dimensions of survival, emphasizing the importance of empathy, integrity, and judicious action. She taught him to recognize the humanity in others while remaining vigilant, to balance compassion with caution, and to understand the ethical implications of every decision. These teachings complemented practical lessons derived from the whispered truths, creating a holistic framework for survival, moral development, and social navigation. The whispers of the quarters also served as a repository of collective memory, preserving the history, experiences, and strategies of previous generations. Elijah, through careful observation and attentive listening, absorbed these lessons, gaining insight into patterns of power, resistance, and adaptation. The community's subtle guidance allowed him to develop a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, social hierarchies, and the dynamics of secrecy and revelation. He learned that knowledge, when wielded wisely, could be a form of empowerment, even in the absence of formal authority or physical power. One afternoon, Elijah observed a subtle intervention orchestrated by the elders. A visitor to the household, unaware of the delicate dynamics surrounding the boy, approached with questions that could have exposed his lineage. The elders subtly redirected the conversation, introduced a distraction. ND guided Elijah's movements to prevent exposure. The precision and coordination of their actions demonstrated the depth of understanding embedded in the whispered truths, highlighting the interplay between vigilance, discretion, and collective intelligence. Elijah witnessed this and internalized the lesson. Survival required both awareness and strategic action. Through these experiences, Elijah developed a sense of agency within the constraints imposed upon him, He learned that while he could not control the actions of the master or the structures of the household, he could influence outcomes through observation, discretion, and calculated action. The whispered truths of the quarters provided both guidance and reassurance, reinforcing the notion that knowledge, when wielded with care, could create pockets of autonomy and protection, even in an environment designed to suppress agency. As Elijah matured, the network of whispers evolved in complexity. Relationships became more nuanced, strategies more sophisticated, and the social fabric of the quarters more tightly interwoven. The recognition of his resemblance to the master continued to shape interactions, guiding both his behavior and the responses of those around him. The whispers were not merely warnings, they were a living system of mentorship, moral guidance, and practical instruction, transmitted through observation, conversation, and subtle signaling. Elijah came to understand that he was both a participant in and a beneficiary of this intricate system, navigating a world of peril with the support of collective wisdom. Ultimately, the whispered truths of the quarters represented more than survival strategies. They embodied a form of resistance. By maintaining discretion, guiding Elijah, and protecting one another, the enslaved community asserted control over knowledge, morality, and agency within a system designed to strip them of autonomy. Elijah's awareness of these dynamics, cultivated through observation and guidance, allowed him to participate in this subtle resistance, reinforcing his sense of identity, resilience, and moral responsibility. Elijah's adolescence brought a reckoning of sorts, a collision between curiosity, awareness, and the inexorable reality of the plantation. The whispered lessons of the quarters had prepared him in part, but nothing could fully shield him from the realization that his very existence was a living testament to acts of power, violation, and secrecy. Each day, as he moved through the household, polished silver, carried water, or observed the interactions between the master, mistress, and overseers, he felt the weight of a legacy that was not of his choosing, but that he was compelled to navigate. He had grown taller, his features sharpening into a mirror of the man who ruled the household. The resemblance, once subtle in the shadows of childhood, was now undeniable. Eyes that mirrored Jonathan Whitmore's gaze, the line of his jaw, the tilt of his he. All of it pressed upon Elijah a truth that could not be ignored. He was a child born of exploitation, his identity intertwined with both oppression and kinship. The moral and social implications of this fact weighed heavily upon him. Each reflection in a mirror, each observation of his own hands, reminded him that he carried a hidden legacy that could not remain secret forever. Ruth continued to guide him, as she had for years, but the conversations grew deeper, more philosophical, and inevitably more painful. "Elijah," she would say, "the world is not kind to those who carry truths others wish hidden. You must understand the choices you make, the words you speak, and the steps you take. Every action has consequences far beyond what you can see." Her tone was stern, layered with maternal love, and heavy with the knowledge that her guidance might be the only shield against disaster. She could not undo the past, but she could arm him with the wisdom to survive it. The whispers of the quarters remained a constant presence, evolving alongside him. The elders spoke more freely in coded language, offering guidance on the nuances of human behavior, the motivations of those in power, and the subtle arts of influence and concealment. Elijah absorbed these lessons with a mix of fascination and dread. Knowledge, he realized, was both empowering and dangerous. Each new understanding brought with it the responsibility to act wisely, to measure words and gestures, and to consider the potential ripple effects of even the smallest disclosure. Elijah began to experiment with control, testing boundaries while maintaining caution. He observed Jonathan Whitmore closely, noting moments when the master's attention lingered, when subtle gestures betrayed guilt or recognition, and when the balance of authority could be influenced by perception. He realized that his resemblance was not merely a source of vulnerability, it could be a tool, if wielded with discretion. He learned to navigate interactions with subtle assertiveness, avoiding direct confrontation while asserting presence and influence in ways that the household could not easily categorize or challenge. This developing awareness extended beyond the walls of the household. Elijah began to perceive the broader implications of his existence within the plantation economy, the social hierarchy of the county, and the moral contradictions of a society built upon enslavement. He understood, in a way only lived experience could teach, but the structures around him were both rigid and porous. Rules existed to enforce control, but human behavior, emotion, and secrecy created spaces where agency could flourish, however cautiously. His education, both formal and informal, was now inseparable from the moral and social realities of his environment. One pivotal afternoon, Elijah found himself alone in the study, a room he had learned to enter only when the household allowed. The sunlight streamed through the tall wind outs, illuminating the polished surfaces and the heavy furniture. He paused before a mirror, his reflection staring back at him with unnerving clarity. The face he saw was unmistakably his own, yet the contours, the eyes, the subtle expressions, all were echoes of Jonathan Whitmore. The realization struck him with force. The reflection was not merely physical, it was a symbol of power, privilege, and transgression, embodied in a body that carried both vulnerability and potential. Elijah's thoughts turned inward, exploring the complexity of identity, morality, and legacy. He recognized that he occupied a space between worlds, neither fully enslaved in the traditional sense, nor fully free of the moral consequences imposed by his birth. His very existence challenged social norms, revealed hidden transgressions, and embodied contradictions that the plantation and its inhabitants could not reconcile easily. The duality of his identity, victim and kin, oppressed and related to power, became a central theme in his understanding of the world. Ruth observed this internalization with a mix of pride and apprehension. She saw the ways in which Elijah grappled with questions of self, morality, and survival, recognizing that he was approaching a stage of awareness where discretion alone might not suffice. She guided him toward a deeper understanding, emphasizing the importance of empathy, ethical judgment, and strategic action. "You carry a truth," she told him one evening, "but how you use it will define you. Be wise, be careful, and remember that survival is not just about hiding. It is about knowing when to act, how to act, and what to leave unspoken." As Elijah matured, the dynamics within the household began to shift subtly. The master's silent guilt remained, but he increasingly relied upon observation and calculation rather than direct control. The mistress's scrutiny became more intense, her awareness of subtle expressions and gestures sharpening with each passing year. The overseer's vigilance also increased, attuned to anomalies in behavior and potential disruptions to the social order. In this environment, Elijah's careful navigation of visibility, action, and restraint became a vital skill, honed through constant practice and observation. The whispered truths of the quarters continued to serve as a guiding framework. Elders provided historical context, moral insight, and practical strategies for managing both authority and subterfuge. They taught Elijah to recognize the difference between immediate safety and long-term survival, emphasizing that discretion, patience, and perception were as critical as obedience or skill. Through this ongoing mentorship, he developed a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, power dynamics, and the moral complexities inherent in a society built upon exploitation. Elijah also began to reflect on his future, contemplating the ways in which he could navigate a life constrained by circumstance yet infused with potential. He understood that his identity, though marked by oppression and secrecy, also carried unique advantages. His resemblance to Jonathan Whitmore, once a source of fear and vulnerability, could be leveraged in subtle ways to influence outcomes, protect allies, and assert autonomy without direct confrontation. The balance of power, he realized, was not fixed. It could be negotiated through knowledge, perception, and strategy. Education, both formal and informal, became a cornerstone of Elijah's approach to life. He sought out books, lessons, and conversations that expanded his understanding of law, history, philosophy, and human behavior. Each new insight reinforced the importance of strategic thinking, ethical judgment, and self-awareness. The lessons of the quarters, combined with observation of the household and careful study, created a foundation for navigating the complexities of a world that sought to define him through both oppression and kinship to power. Elijah's moral reasoning also evolved. He began to understand the ethical implications of action and inaction, the responsibilities inherent in knowledge, and the consequences of visibility. He grappled with questions of justice, fairness, and retribution, recognizing that the legacy he inherited was both a burden and an opportunity. The choices he made in responding to his resemblance, his birthright, and the social realities of the plantation would define not only his survival but his character and future. One significant moment occurred when Elijah confronted a situation involving a younger child in the quarters, whose safety was threatened by the indiscretions of another servant. Drawing upon lessons learned from Ruth, the elders, and his own observation, Elijah intervened subtly, redirecting attention, guiding behavior, and protecting the child without attracting scrutiny. The success of this action reinforced his understanding that knowledge, discretion, and moral courage could coexist, allowing him to exert influence while preserving both safety and secrecy. As the years progressed, Elijah also recognized the emotional complexity of his relationship with the Master. Jonathan Whitmore's silent guilt, his subtle attentions, and his calculated avoidance all contributed to an intricate web of tension, recognition, and potential leverage. Elijah understood that the Master, while a figure of authority, was also vulnerable to exposure, moral reckoning, and social consequences. This awareness informed his behavior, guiding interactions with subtlety, intelligence, and strategic consideration. Elijah's reflection on his hidden legacy extended to the broader social and cultural context. He recognized the systemic nature of oppression, the contradictions inherent in a society that sanctioned exploitation while demanding obedience and propriety. He understood that his existence challenged assumptions, revealed transgressions, and embodied the moral complexities of a world built up on hierarchy and secrecy. The hidden legacy he carried was not solely personal. It was emblematic of the contradictions and injustices of the society in which he lived. In confronting this hidden legacy, Elijah developed resilience, insight, and moral discernment. He recognized the necessity of navigating a world constrained by systemic oppression, the moral obligations imposed by knowledge, and the strategic imperatives of survival. His ability to observe, interpret, and act with discretion became a central feature of his identity, allowing him to navigate the plantation with a combination of awareness, prudence, and ethical judgment. Ultimately, Elijah's journey of confronting his hidden legacy was a testament to human adaptability, intelligence, and moral courage. He navigated the intersection of visibility and secrecy, vulnerability and influence, oppression and kinship with care and strategic insight. The lessons of the quarters, the guidance of Ruth, and his own observations converged to create a framework for understanding both the practical and moral dimensions of his existence. He carried within him a reflection of transgression and power, a living legacy that demanded careful navigation, ethical reflection, and courage in the face of systemic oppression. As he moved forward, Elijah understood that the hidden legacy he bore was not merely a burden but a responsibility. He recognized that knowledge, awareness, and moral discernment could serve as tools for protection, guidance, and influence. By confronting the reality of his birth, his resemblance, and the social consequences embedded in his existence, he began to chart a path that balanced survival with ethical agency, discretion with insight, and resilience with strategic action. His life became a living negotiation with history, identity, and morality, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge, courage, and human adaptability in the face of oppression.